Welcome back to RetroWheelsVault, where horsepower never dies. If you're a returning viewer, you might notice that this isn't the first time we've covered this particular car. But due to a little deal with YouTube copyright stuff, we're back with a brand new and even better version. Same classic car, same deep dive, but now with a fresh coat of storytelling polish and absolutely no copyright in the mix. Today we're unlocking one of the quirkiest creations ever to roll off a Pontiac assembly line, or re-unlocking it. The 1963 Pontiac Tempest. This isn't your typical muscle car. It's the mechanical equivalent of someone showing up to a black tie event wearing a leather jacket and a grin. With a rear-mounted transaxle, a drive shaft that flexes like a gymnast, and an engine setup that sounds like someone lost half a V8, the Tempest wasn't afraid to be different. So buckle up, because this ride's got more twists than a spaghetti western. Another classic unlocked, another beast revived. And let's be honest, modern cars forgot what muscle means. Here, we remember. Let's re-dive under the hood of a car that didn't just challenge the rules. It tossed them out the window doing 60. Let's talk about one of the Tempest's coolest party tricks. Its rear-mounted transaxle. That's right. In an era when most American cars stuck to the tried-and-true front-engine rear-drive layout, Pontiac said, what if we just moved the whole transmission to the back? And so, the 1963 Tempest became one of the first American cars to feature a rear transaxle. Borrowed inspiration from European sports cars like the Porsche 356. That's like a linebacker taking ballet lessons and suddenly pirouetting better than the quarterback. The benefit? Much better weight distribution. Instead of all the mechanical guts hanging out front like a dad bod in a muscle t-shirt, the Tempest balanced itself like a gymnast on a balance beam. And improved handling, especially for a car in this class. Sure, it wasn't exactly a Ferrari, but for a Detroit Iron, it cornered with a little more grace than you'd expect. And while most American automakers were stuck in the bigger is better mindset, Pontiac decided to sprinkle in a bit of European finesse. Kind of like putting tap shoes on a bear and watching it unexpectedly nail a dance routine. It was weird, wonderful, and way ahead of its time. When it comes to design and construction, the 1963 Pontiac Tempest was like the automotive equivalent of a jazz solo, offbeat, daring, and somehow it just worked. At first glance, it looked like your typical early 60s compact. Clean lines, subtle chrome, and a modest profile that wouldn't raise eyebrows in a church parking lot. But under that conservative sheet metal, pure Pontiac experimentation. Built on GM's wide-body platform, the Tempest had a unibody construction, a rarity among domestic cars of the time. It made the car lighter and more rigid, giving it the structural backbone of a gymnast in a tuxedo. For 1963, Pontiac cleaned up the styling, sharpening the lines, giving it a more mature, refined look. Gone were the awkward angles of earlier models. This Tempest meant only business. But here's the kicker. While it may have looked mild-mannered, the Tempest was hiding innovations that would make German engineers raise an eyebrow. It was a car designed to challenge conventions, not with brute force, but with cleverness. Think of it like the nerd in the back of the class who secretly bench presses twice his weight and just invented cold fusion in study hall. Different? Absolutely. But forget normal. The Tempest was built to be brilliantly weird. Now let's talk engine performance, the heart of the beast, or in this case, half a heart. Literally, the 1963 Pontiac Tempest base engine was the infamous Trophy 4, a 195 cubic inch inline 4 that was basically a 389 V8, chopped in half like someone took a buzzsaw to Pontiac's big block and said, close enough. This Frankenstein power pump pumped out anywhere from 110 to 166 horsepower depending on carburation and compression. Not bad for a 4-cylinder, but it wasn't exactly smooth. In fact, it shook like a washing machine on spin cycle with a brick in it. Balanced? Not at all. But boy, did it have character. Then came the real star of the show, the optional 326 V8. Technically a 336 CID engine with a marketing-friendly name. With 260 horsepower, it gave the Tempest some legitimate street cred. Suddenly, this quirky compact could scoot like a caffeinated squirrel on roller skates. Paired with Pontiac's rear transaxle layout, the engine's placement gave her a near 50-50 weight distribution, improved handling more than anyone expected. Sure, it wasn't burning rubber like a GTO just yet, but it was flexing muscles in a class full of paperweights. Understated? Maybe. Underrated? Absolutely. The Tempest had the guts. If the engine was the Tempest's heart, then the drivetrain was its nervous system. And let's just say Pontiac wired up like a mad scientist on a coffee binge. Instead of a conventional layout, the 63 Tempest featured one of the quirkiest configurations in American automotive history, a rear-mounted transaxle connected to the engine by a flexible drive shaft, known affectionately and sometimes mockingly as the rope drive. This wasn't a typo or a fever dream. Pontiac engineers actually used a 5-foot-long curved steel shaft that rotated at engine speed inside a torque tube. Why? Because it allowed the engine to sit lower in the chassis, improve weight distribution, and gave the car surprisingly good handling. It was like someone gave an American car the soul of a European racer, if that racer had a slight tremor. Transmission options included a 3-speed manual, a 4-speed manual for those to do their own shift on their own destiny, or the 2-speed automatic Tempest torque, which sounds like a dance move but was actually GM's take on a lightweight rear transaxle automatic. The whole setup was bold, bizarre, and a little brilliant, like Pontiac looked at the rulebook and said, "Neat! Now let's do the exact opposite." The chassis suspension of the 1963 Pontiac Tempest was like a rebellious teenager, refusing to conform, doing things its own way, and somehow pulling it off with style. At a time when most American cars are rocking solid rear axles like it was still 1949, the Tempest went full renegade with an independent rear suspension, a bold move that made it ride smoother and handle corners like it had something to prove. Up front, it used a fairly conventional unequal length A-arm setup with coil springs, but out back is where things got spicy. Thanks to the rear transaxle, Pontiac had the freedom to ditch the bulky rear axle in favor of a swing axle independent rear suspension, giving the Tempest handling characteristics more in line with the European saloon than a Detroit cruiser. It didn't exactly corner like a Porsche, but compared to its competition, it was practically Fred Astaire in a room full of Frankenstein's monsters. The unibody construction helped too, reducing weight and adding rigidity because a flexible drive shaft doesn't need a flexible frame. Sure, it wasn't perfect. The rear suspension could get a little funky under hard cornering, but for 1963, the Tempest handled like it had read ahead in a textbook of automotive evolution. Step inside the 1963 Pontiac Tempest and you're greeted with an interior that's the automotive equivalent of a well-tailored suit. Functional, no nonsense, but with just enough flair to keep things interesting. It wasn't trying to be a spaceship, but it also wasn't a cardboard box on wheels. Think clean lines, durable materials, and a layout that said, "I'm here to drive, not to confuse you with buttons and gizmos." The dashboard was straightforward, with big, easy-to-read gauges that looked like they came from a cockpit, simple speedometer, fuel gauge, and temperature dials. No digital screens, no touch controls, just pure analog charm. Controls were intuitive, with chunky knobs and switches that gave satisfying clicks like they meant business. Optional bucket seats in the center console gave the Tempest a sportier vibe, making it feel less like a grocery getter and more like a weekend warrior's ride. The interior materials were solid but not overly plush. Think more workhorse than luxury lounge. As for technology, the Tempest wasn't packing radar or Wi-Fi, but it did offer options like an AM radio and a heater, basic necessities for escaping boring commutes or chasing down the next adventure. It was simple, honest, and just enough to keep you focused on the road ahead. Now here's a fun twist. Despite what the 1992 movie My Cousin Vinny, starring Joe Pesci, Marissa Tomei, Ralph Macchio, and Fred Gwynne, famously claimed, the 1963 Pontiac Tempest did not have a limited sub-differential. Hollywood took a little creative license there. In reality, it used a standard open differential tucked into its quirky rear transaxle setup. No fancy torque shuffling wizardry here, just your basic one-tire fire when things got spicy. Sure, it wasn't track ready, but it got the job done with blue-collar grit. So while Vinny won the case with that line, car nerds everywhere cringed just a little. Proof that even courtroom drama can spin its wheels when it comes to car facts. Dimensionally, the 1963 Pontiac Tempest sat right in that automotive sweet spot. Big enough to feel substantial, but not so bloated it needed to own its own zip code. At 194.3 inches long, it stretched out like a Sunday nap on the couch. Roomy, but not ridiculous. With a width of 74.2 inches, it had enough shoulder room to keep elbows from bumping, while still fitting comfortably in the average garage without requiring a 3-point turn just to park. Standing 55.3 inches tall, it had that low, round, road-hugging stance, like it was crouching ready to pounce. The 112-inch wheelbase gave it a nicely balanced footprint, improving ride comfort and giving the transaxle layout a solid platform to work its magic. And tipping the scales at 3,325 pounds, the Tempest wasn't exactly featherweight, but it wasn't lugging around unnecessary flab either. Think of it as the middleweight boxer of the early 60s compacts. Agile, tough, and ready to throw a punch if provoked. Overall, the Tempest's proportions struck a clever balance between compact agility and mid-sized comfort. Not too big, not too small. Goldilocks would have driven one, assuming she liked oddball drivetrains and a dash of Detroit daring. The 1963 Pontiac Tempest had strengths that made it a standout and quirks that made it, well, an acquired taste. Its biggest strength? Innovation. It wasn't just another cookie-cutter compact. It had a rear transaxle, independent rear suspension, and a flexible rope drive that made engineers scratch their heads and gearheads grin. It offered balanced handling, a comfortable ride, and a unique personality in a sea of bland boxes on wheels. Throw in the optional 326 V8, and the Tempest could surprise a few bigger cars at a red light. It was clever, courageous, and a little ahead of its time. But no muscle car tale is complete without a few wrenches in the gears. That rope drive? Genius on paper, but in real life it could twist, rattle, and whine like a toddler on a sugar crash. The swing axle rear suspension, while innovative, had its limits. Push it too hard in the corners and the Tempest might get twitchier than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. And let's not forget the shaky four-cylinder, which idled like a blender full of bolts. Still, despite all the weirdness, the 63 Tempest was bold. Imperfect? Sure. But boring? Never. It was Pontiac's weird little masterpiece. And that's a wrap on our revisited and copyright-safe journey to the wonderfully weird world of the 1963 Pontiac Tempest. From its half a V8 heartbeat to its spaghetti flex rope driveshaft and that famously non-limited slip differential, sorry Vinny, this car marched to the beat of its own off-kilter four-cylinder drum. It didn't follow trends. It set them sideways, spun them around, and bolted them to the back end for better balance. The Tempest wasn't just a car. It was a mad scientist experiment that actually made it off the lab table and onto America's roads. It had its flaws, sure, but it dared to be different in a decade that was just learning to rev its muscle-bound engine. Now we want to hear from you. Well, was the Tempest an underrated pioneer, or just a glorified oddball in Pontiac's lineup? Drop your thoughts, stories, and hot takes in the comments below. And if you like this rebooted ride through retro greatness, hit that like button, subscribe to RetroWheelsVault, and ring that bell so you never miss another resurrected legend. Because really, modern cars just forgot what muscle means. Remember, keep it loud, keep it classic, and we'll see you next time.